Welcome to our very first journey through the Star Wars galaxy. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most significant rites of passage in the Jedi Order, the Jedi Trials. These ancient tests have shaped the destiny of countless Force users, separating those who would become knights from those who would follow different paths. Before we begin this deep dive into the traditions and challenges that defined the Jedi, if you enjoy these explorations of Star Wars lore, hitting that subscribe button really helps the channel grow. Now, settle in as we unravel the trials that transformed Padawans into Jedi Knights. The Jedi Trials stand as one of the most enduring traditions in the galaxy's history, a series of challenges designed to test every aspect of a Padawan's training. These weren't arbitrary obstacles or simple examinations. They were carefully crafted experiences meant to push young Jedi to their absolute limits, revealing whether they possessed not just the skills, but the character necessary to bear the title of Jedi Knight. For thousands of years, these trials remained a constant in an ever-changing galaxy, adapting to circumstances while maintaining their core purpose, ensuring that only those truly ready would take on the responsibilities of knighthood. To understand the Jedi Trials, we must first understand their place in the broader structure of Jedi training. A Force-sensitive child's journey began when they were identified and brought to the Jedi Temple, usually as an infant or very young child. These younglings would spend years in the temple, learning the basics of the Force, lightsaber combat, and the Jedi Code under the guidance of multiple instructors. This initial phase of training was communal, with groups of younglings learning together in clans. When a youngling reached approximately 12 or 13 years of age, they faced their first major test, the Initiate Trials. These preliminary examinations determined whether a youngling was ready to become a Padawan. The Initiate Trials tested basic competency in Force use, lightsaber skills, and knowledge of Jedi philosophy. Success meant the opportunity to be chosen by a Jedi Knight or Master as their apprentice. Failure meant assignment to the Jedi Service Corps, where they would serve the Order in non-combat roles, or in some cases, leaving the Order entirely. Those fortunate enough to be selected as Padawans entered a new phase of their education. For the next decade or more, they would train one-on-one with their master, accompanying them on missions throughout the galaxy, learning through direct experience and personal instruction. This apprenticeship was intense and deeply personal, forging bonds between master and student that often lasted a lifetime. The Padawan learned not just techniques, but wisdom. Not just how to use the Force, but when and why. But even the most dedicated Padawan training had an endpoint. When a master believed their apprentice was ready, when the Jedi High Council agreed that a Padawan had reached the necessary level of skill and maturity, the time came for the trials of knighthood. These were the tests that would determine whether a Padawan would ascend to become a full Jedi Knight, taking their place among the Order's ranks as an independent agent of peace and justice. The Jedi trials were administered by the Jedi High Council, that august body of 12 masters who guided the Order's direction and made its most important decisions. The Council took this responsibility seriously, understanding that every knight they elevated would represent the Order throughout the galaxy. A poorly prepared knight could cause immense damage, not just to themselves, but to the Jedi's reputation and the people they were sworn to protect. The trials had to be rigorous enough to ensure readiness, but fair enough to give every worthy candidate a genuine chance to succeed. The primary trials were a set of 5 distinct tests, each designed to evaluate a different aspect of a Jedi's character and capabilities. These were the trial of skill, the trial of courage, the trial of the flesh, the trial of spirit, and the trial of insight. Together, they formed a comprehensive examination of everything a Jedi needed to succeed in their role. Let's explore each of these trials in detail, understanding what they tested and why they mattered. The trial of skill was perhaps the most straightforward of the 5 tests, though straightforward didn't mean easy. This trial evaluated a Padawan's mastery of lightsaber combat, force abilities, and physical prowess. It was a demonstration that the candidate possessed the technical competencies necessary for a Jedi Knight. After all, Knights would often find themselves in dangerous situations, facing enemies who wouldn't hesitate to kill them. They needed to prove they could defend themselves and others. The specific format of the trial of skill varied depending on the era and the Council's preferences. In many cases, it involved combat against training droids or simulated opponents. The Padawan might be required to deflect blaster bolts while blindfolded, demonstrating their connection to the Force and their ability to sense danger without relying on physical sight. They might need to navigate an obstacle course that tested their agility, their ability to use the Force to enhance their physical capabilities, and their tactical thinking under pressure. In some instances, the trial of skill took the form of a duel against the Battle Master, the Jedi responsible for training the Order in combat techniques. This wasn't a fight to the death, or even to defeat. The Padawan wasn't expected to beat a master in single combat. Rather, they needed to demonstrate competence, to show that they could hold their own, that they understood the principles of lightsaber combat and could apply them under pressure. The Battle Master would evaluate their form, their adaptability, their ability to read an opponent and respond appropriately. The trial also tested Force abilities beyond combat. A Padawan might be required to levitate heavy objects, demonstrating fine control over telekinesis. They might need to use Force persuasion to accomplish a specific goal, showing their understanding of the mind trick and its ethical applications. They might be asked to sense the presence of hidden objects or people, proving their ability to extend their awareness through the Force. What the Council looked for in the trial of skill wasn't perfection. They understood that a newly elevated knight would continue to grow and develop their abilities throughout their career. What they needed to see was competence, a solid foundation of skills that the Padawan could build upon. They needed to know that this person wouldn't be helpless in a crisis, that they possessed the basic tools necessary to fulfill their duties as a knight. Interestingly, the trial of skill could sometimes be passed through actions in the field, rather than in a formal testing environment. If a Padawan demonstrated exceptional skill during a mission, particularly in combat against a formidable opponent, the Council might determine that they had effectively passed this trial through their real-world performance. This happened with several notable Jedi throughout history, including Obi-Wan Kenobi, whose battle against Darth Maul was considered sufficient proof of his combat prowess. The trial of courage tested something far less tangible than technical skill, but equally essential. A Jedi Knight would face danger regularly, would be called upon to act when others fled, to stand firm when fear urged retreat. The Order needed to know that its knights possessed the courage necessary to fulfill their duties, even when those duties terrified them. This trial took many forms, but all shared a common element. They forced the Padawan to confront fear directly. In some cases, this meant facing a genuinely dangerous situation. The Padawan might be sent on a mission where failure could mean death, where the stakes were real and the danger immediate. They had to prove they could function under pressure, that fear wouldn't paralyze them or cause them to make reckless decisions. In other instances, the trial of courage involved confronting personal fears rather than external dangers. The Council might use force techniques or technology to create illusions that targeted the Padawan's specific anxieties. Someone afraid of heights might find themselves on a narrow ledge high above a chasm. Someone who feared failure might be placed in a scenario where they had to make impossible choices with no clear right answer. The trial wasn't about eliminating fear, which the Jedi understood was impossible and even undesirable. Fear served a purpose, alerting beings to danger and helping them survive. Rather, the trial tested whether the Padawan could act despite their fear, whether they could acknowledge their terror and still do what needed to be done. The trial of courage also evaluated moral courage, the willingness to do what was right even when it was difficult or unpopular. A Padawan might be placed in a situation where they had to choose between following orders and following their conscience, where they had to stand up to authority or challenge accepted wisdom. The Jedi Order valued obedience and respect for hierarchy, but it valued integrity more. A knight who would blindly follow any order, no matter how wrong, was dangerous. The Order needed knights who would speak truth to power when necessary, who would prioritize doing right over doing what was easy. Like the trial of skill, the trial of courage could be passed through actions during actual missions. If a Padawan demonstrated exceptional bravery in the face of genuine danger, if they acted courageously when it truly mattered, the Council might determine that they had proven themselves sufficiently. Anakin Skywalker's actions during the Clone Wars, for instance, were considered more than adequate proof of his courage, eliminating the need for a formal trial. The trial of the flesh was widely regarded as one of the most difficult and dangerous of the 5 trials. This test required the Padawan to endure significant physical pain or loss, to prove that they could maintain their connection to the light side of the Force even when suffering. The name itself was somewhat misleading, as the trial tested not just physical endurance, but emotional and psychological resilience as well. In ancient times, the trial of the flesh took brutal forms. During the pious Dea era, thousands of years before the Clone Wars, Padawans underwent a ritual called the Burning, where they were subjected to intense pain to test their ability to withstand torture without breaking. This practice was eventually abandoned as barbaric, but it established the trial's fundamental principle. A Jedi must be able to endure suffering without being corrupted by it, without turning to anger or hatred or the dark side. In later eras, the trial of the flesh often involved the loss of something precious to the Padawan. This might be a physical loss, such as the amputation of a limb. Many Jedi throughout history passed this trial by losing a hand or arm in combat, proving their ability to continue functioning despite severe injury. Anakin Skywalker lost his arm in his duel with Count Dooku, and this was recognized as his trial of the flesh. His son, Luke Skywalker, would later pass the same trial in the same way, losing his hand to his father's lightsaber. But the loss didn't have to be physical. The trial of the flesh could involve emotional loss as well. The death of someone close to the Padawan, the betrayal of a trusted friend, the failure of a mission they cared deeply about. What mattered was that the Padawan experienced genuine suffering and demonstrated their ability to process that suffering without being consumed by it. They had to show that pain wouldn't drive them to revenge, that loss wouldn't lead them to despair, that they could maintain their commitment to the Jedi path even when that path led through darkness. The trial also tested the Padawan's relationship with attachment. The Jedi Code warned against attachment, teaching that possessive relationships led to fear of loss, and fear of loss led to the dark side. The trial of the flesh often forced Padawans to confront their attachments directly, to experience the pain of loss, and prove they could let go. This was perhaps the most philosophically complex aspect of the trial, as it required the Padawan to balance compassion with non-attachment, to care deeply about others, while accepting that loss was inevitable. The danger of the trial of the flesh was real. Some Padawans didn't survive it. Others survived physically but were so traumatized that they couldn't continue as Jedi. The Council had to carefully calibrate the trial, making it challenging enough to truly test the Padawan, but not so extreme that it destroyed them. This was a delicate balance, and the Council didn't always get it right. Like the other trials, the trial of the flesh could be passed through real-world experiences. If a Padawan suffered significant injury or loss during a mission and demonstrated appropriate resilience, the Council might determine that they had proven themselves sufficiently. This was actually the most common way this particular trial was passed, as the dangerous nature of Jedi work meant that most Padawans experienced significant hardship during their apprenticeship. The trial of spirit was perhaps the most mysterious and personal of the 5 trials. This test required the Padawan to confront themselves, to face their own darkness and emerge victorious. It was an internal journey, a battle fought not against external enemies, but against the shadows within one's own heart. The most common method for administering the trial of spirit involved deep meditation. The Padawan would enter a trance-like state, guided by the Force into a vision or experience that forced them to confront aspects of themselves they might prefer to ignore. They might face their potential for darkness, seeing what they could become if they gave in to anger or fear or hatred. They might relive their greatest failures, forced to examine their mistakes and accept responsibility for them. They might encounter manifestations of their doubts, their insecurities, their hidden desires. The trial often took the form of a confrontation with a dark version of oneself. The Padawan might face a vision of themselves as a Sith or dark Jedi, might have to battle this dark reflection and overcome it. This wasn't a physical fight, though it might feel like one within the vision. It was a spiritual struggle, a test of the Padawan's commitment to the light side when faced with the seductive power of darkness. Luke Skywalker's experience in the cave on Dagobah exemplified this trial of spirit. Though it wasn't formally administered as such, when he entered the dark side cave and faced a vision of Darth Vader, only to discover his own face beneath the mask, he was confronting the truth that he carried the potential for darkness within himself. He was facing the reality that he could become like Vader if he wasn't careful. That the line between Jedi and Sith was thinner than he wanted to believe. The trial of spirit also tested the Padawan's understanding of the Force itself. They had to demonstrate that they comprehended the balance between light and dark, that they understood the temptations of the dark side and how to resist them. They had to show that their commitment to the Jedi path was based on genuine understanding rather than blind obedience, that they had chosen the light side consciously and would continue to choose it even when darkness offered easier paths to power. Some Padawans experienced the trial of spirit through encounters with actual dark side users or locations, a mission that brought them into contact with Sith artifacts or dark side Force users might serve as their trial, testing their ability to resist corruption when exposed to darkness directly. The key was that they had to face temptation and overcome it, had to be offered power or revenge or some other dark desire, and choose to refuse it. The trial of spirit was deeply personal, and the Council understood that what constituted an adequate test varied from individual to individual. Someone who struggled with anger needed to prove they could control their temper. Someone tempted by power needed to demonstrate they could refuse it. Someone afraid of their own potential for darkness needed to confront that fear and accept that they contained both light and shadow, but could choose which to nurture. This trial couldn't really be failed in the traditional sense. If a Padawan gave in to darkness during the trial of spirit, they didn't simply fail to become a knight. They fell to the dark side, becoming something the Order would have to deal with as a threat rather than a student. The stakes were existential, making this trial particularly dangerous despite its internal nature. The Trial of Insight was the final of the 5 primary trials, and in many ways the most subtle. This test evaluated the Padawans' wisdom, their ability to perceive truth beneath deception, to understand complex situations and make sound judgments. A Jedi Knight would often serve as a diplomat, mediator, or investigator. They needed to be able to see through lies, to understand people's true motivations, to solve problems that weren't amenable to lightsaber solutions. The trial typically involved presenting the Padawan with a puzzle or mystery that required careful analysis to solve. This might be a diplomatic scenario, where they had to determine which of several parties was lying. It might be a criminal investigation, where they had to piece together evidence to identify a culprit. It might be a philosophical problem that tested their understanding of Jedi principles and their ability to apply those principles to complex, real-world situations. Illusion played a major role in many versions of the Trial of Insight. The Padawan might be placed in a scenario where nothing was as it seemed, where they had to use the Force and their own perceptiveness to distinguish reality from deception. They might face holographic projections or Force-created illusions designed to confuse and mislead them. Their task was to see through these deceptions, to find the truth hidden beneath layers of falsehood. The trial also tested the Padawan's ability to understand people. They might be required to mediate a dispute, to understand the underlying causes of a conflict, and find a solution that addressed those root causes rather than just treating symptoms. They might need to counsel someone in distress, demonstrating empathy and wisdom. They might have to make a difficult ethical judgment, weighing competing values and choosing the course of action that best served the greater good. What made the Trial of Insight particularly challenging was that it often had no clear right answer. Unlike the Trial of Skill, where success meant demonstrating specific competencies, or the Trial of Courage, where success meant acting despite fear, the Trial of Insight frequently presented situations where multiple approaches could be valid. The Council wasn't looking for the Padawan to find a single correct solution. They were evaluating the Padawan's reasoning process, their ability to consider multiple perspectives, their wisdom in weighing options and making decisions. The trial tested whether the Padawan had truly internalized the Jedi teachings or merely memorized them. It was one thing to recite the Jedi Code. It was another to understand what that code meant in practice, to apply its principles to messy, real-world situations where the right choice wasn't obvious. The Council needed to know that their knights could think for themselves, could make sound judgments even when no master was present to guide them. Like the other trials, the Trial of Insight could be passed through real-world experiences. If a Padawan demonstrated exceptional wisdom or perceptiveness during a mission, if they solved a complex problem or saw through a sophisticated deception, the Council might determine that they had proven their insight sufficiently. Ahsoka Tano's efforts to prove her innocence when falsely accused of bombing the Jedi Temple, for instance, demonstrated the kind of investigative skill and determination that the trial of insight was meant to test. These 5 trials, skill, courage, flesh, spirit, and insight, formed the core of the testing process. But the Jedi High Council maintained flexibility in how they administered the trials. They understood that rigid adherence to formal testing procedures might not always serve the Order's best interests. Sometimes, circumstances called for alternative approaches. One important alternative was the concept of passing trials through exceptional service. If a Padawan's actions during actual missions demonstrated that they had effectively met the requirements of one or more trials, the Council could waive the formal testing for those trials. This wasn't a shortcut or a lowering of standards. Rather, it was recognition that real-world challenges often provided better tests than artificial scenarios could. This approach became particularly common during times of crisis, such as the Clone Wars. The galaxy-spanning conflict provided countless opportunities for Padawans to prove themselves in ways that formal trials couldn't match. Combat against separatist forces tested skill and courage. The hardships of war tested flesh and spirit. The complex political and military situations tested insight. Many Padawans during this era passed multiple trials, or even all 5, through their service in the war. Anakin Skywalker's elevation to knighthood exemplified this approach. He never underwent formal trials in the traditional sense. Instead, the Council determined that his actions during the Clone Wars had proven him in all 5 areas. His combat prowess was undeniable, satisfying the trial of skill. His courage in battle was legendary, passing the trial of courage. The loss of his arm to Count Dooku served as his trial of the flesh. His resistance to Dooku's attempts to turn him to the dark side demonstrated his spirit, and his tactical acumen and problem-solving abilities showed his insight. The Council elevated him to knighthood based on this comprehensive real-world demonstration of his capabilities. This flexibility extended to the format of the trials as well. While the Jedi Temple on Coruscant had a dedicated trials chamber designed specifically for testing Padawans, trials could be administered elsewhere if necessary. Jedi serving far from Coruscant might undergo their trials at other Jedi facilities, or even in the field. What mattered was that the trials adequately tested the required qualities, not that they followed a specific format or occurred in a specific location. The Council could also design custom trials tailored to individual Padawans. If a particular student had a specific weakness that needed to be tested, or a unique strength that should be evaluated, the Council might create a trial specifically for them. This personalization ensured that the trials remained relevant and challenging for each candidate, rather than becoming a one-size-fits-all process that might not adequately evaluate every Padawan. However, this flexibility had limits. The Council took the trials seriously and wouldn't compromise on the fundamental requirement that a Padawan demonstrate readiness for knighthood. No amount of political pressure or personal favoritism would lead them to elevate someone who hadn't proven themselves. The trials existed to protect both the Order and the galaxy, ensuring that only those truly prepared for the title of Jedi Knight. What happened if a Padawan failed the trials? This was a question that weighed heavily on every apprentice approaching this crucial test. The answer was both reassuring and sobering. Failure wasn't necessarily the end of a Padawan's journey, but it was a serious setback that required careful consideration of next steps. A Padawan who failed one or more trials was typically given the opportunity to try again. The trials were difficult by design, and the Council understood that even worthy candidates might not succeed on their first attempt. The Padawan would return to training with their master, working to address whatever deficiencies the trials had revealed. When both the master and the Padawan felt ready, they could request another attempt. However, repeated failures raised serious questions. If a Padawan tried multiple times and continued to fall short, it suggested that they might not be suited for knighthood, at least not at that time. The Council had to consider whether continued attempts were helping the Padawan grow or simply subjecting them to repeated trauma. They also had to think about the Order's needs and whether resources devoted to a struggling Padawan might be better used elsewhere. For Padawans who ultimately couldn't pass the trials, several options existed. The most common was assignment to the Jedi Service Corps. This organization provided a place within the Order for those who couldn't become knights, but still wanted to serve. The Service Corps had multiple branches, each focused on different types of work. The Agricultural Corps helped struggling worlds improve their farming and food production. The Medical Corps provided healing services throughout the galaxy. The Educational Corps taught in schools and universities. The Exploration Corps charted unknown regions of space. Service in these corps was honorable work that genuinely helped people. It wasn't a punishment or a consolation prize. Many Jedi found deep satisfaction in Service Corps work, using their Force abilities and training to make real differences in people's lives without the combat and danger that came with being a knight. However, it was undeniably different from the path most Padawans had envisioned for themselves, and the transition could be emotionally difficult. Another option was to leave the Order entirely. Jedi who chose this path were released from their vows and free to pursue whatever life they wished in the wider galaxy. Some became teachers, sharing their knowledge without the formal structure of the Order. Others entered politics, business, or other civilian careers. A few even married and started families, something forbidden to active Jedi. The Order didn't view leaving as a failure or betrayal. They understood that the Jedi path wasn't right for everyone, and they preferred that people who didn't fit leave peacefully rather than remain and become problems. The emotional impact of failing the trials shouldn't be underestimated. For most Padawans, becoming a knight was a goal they'd worked toward their entire lives. Failure could be devastating, triggering feelings of inadequacy, shame, and loss. Masters had to be particularly attentive during this period, helping their apprentices process their emotions in healthy ways and avoid the spiral into anger or despair that could lead to the dark side. The trials also had a darker side that's worth acknowledging. The intense pressure they created, the high stakes, the very real possibility of failure, all of this could push Padawans toward questionable decisions. Some might be tempted to cheat, to use forbidden techniques or seek unfair advantages. Others might become so obsessed with passing that they lost sight of why they wanted to be Jedi in the first place. The trials were meant to reveal character, but they could also corrupt it if a Padawan wasn't careful. There were also questions about whether the trials were truly fair and equitable. Did they favor certain types of Jedi over others? Were combat-focused Padawans more likely to pass than those with diplomatic or scholarly inclinations? Did the trials adequately account for different species' abilities and limitations? These were debates that occurred within the Order periodically, with some arguing for reforms to make the trials more inclusive, and others insisting that the standards existed for good reasons and shouldn't be diluted. The ceremony that followed successful completion of the trials was one of the most significant moments in a Jedi's life. After the Council confirmed that a Padawan had passed all required tests, preparations began for the knighting ceremony. This ritual marked the formal transition from apprentice to knight, from student to independent Jedi. Before the ceremony, the Padawan spent an entire day in deep meditation within a special preparation room. This wasn't just a formality. It was a final opportunity for reflection, for the soon-to-be knight to contemplate the journey that had brought them to this point and the responsibilities they were about to assume. They meditated on the Jedi Code, on their experiences during training, on the trials they had overcome. They prepared themselves mentally and spiritually for the new role they would take on. As the appointed time approached, the Padawan would leave the preparation room and proceed to the Hall of Knighthood. This chamber, located within the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, was designed specifically for this ceremony. It was a solemn space, dimly lit, with the Jedi High Council assembled to witness the elevation. Other Jedi might attend as well, particularly the Padawan's master and close friends, but the ceremony itself was relatively intimate. The Padawan would kneel before the Grand Master of the Jedi Order, the leader of the Council, and the highest-ranking Jedi. In a gesture rich with symbolism, the Grand Master would ignite
their lightsaber and use it to sever the Padawan's braid. This braid, worn throughout their apprenticeship, was the visible symbol of their status as a learner. Its removal marked the end of that phase of their life. The Grand Master would then speak words that had been used for thousands of years, formally elevating the Padawan to the rank of knight. The exact phrasing varied somewhat over the millennia, but the core meaning remained constant. The new knight was recognized as a full member of the Order, entrusted with the responsibilities and privileges that came with that status. They were no longer bound to a master, no longer required to seek permission for their actions. They were independent agents of the Jedi Order, answerable to the Council, but free to pursue their own path in service to the Force. The ceremony concluded with the new knight rising and being congratulated by the council members and other attendees. Their former master would often present them with a gift, perhaps a holocron containing wisdom for their journey ahead, or a crystal for constructing a new lightsaber.
The new knight would then leave the hall, no longer a Padawan, but a full Jedi Knight, ready to take on whatever challenges the galaxy might present. This moment was profound for everyone involved. For the new knight, it represented the culmination of years or even decades of training, the achievement of a goal they'd worked towards since childhood. For their master, it was a moment of pride, mixed with a touch of sadness, as the close bond of the master-Padawan relationship transformed into something different. For the Order, it was the addition of another knight to their ranks, another defender of peace and justice in a galaxy that always needed more of both. But the ceremony also marked a beginning as much as an ending. Knighthood wasn't the final stage of a Jedi's development. It was, in many ways, just the start of their real work. As a Padawan, they had learned under supervision, with a master to guide them and correct their mistakes. As a knight, they would face challenges alone, making decisions that could affect countless lives, with no one to fall back on but themselves. The trials had tested whether they were ready for this responsibility. Now they would have to prove it in the field. The Jedi trials evolved significantly over the Order's long history. What worked in one era might not be appropriate in another, and the Council periodically reviewed and adjusted the trials to ensure they remained relevant and effective. Understanding this evolution helps us appreciate how the trials adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining their core purpose. In the earliest days of the Jedi Order, thousands of years before the Clone Wars, the trials were far less formalized. A Padawan's master had significant discretion in determining when their apprentice was ready for knighthood. The trials, such as they were, might be administered by the master alone, without council oversight. This led to inconsistency, with some masters being far more demanding than others. The quality of knights varied widely, and the Order recognized this as a problem. The establishment of the Jedi High Council brought standardization to the trials. The Council took over responsibility for administering the tests, ensuring that all Padawans faced similar challenges, regardless of who their master was. This created more consistency in the quality of knights, though it also reduced masters' autonomy and created some resentment among those who felt the Council was overstepping. During certain periods, particularly times of crisis, the trials became more lenient out of necessity. When the Order needed more knights urgently, when Padawans were dying in combat before completing their training, the Council might lower the bar somewhat, elevating Padawans who showed promise even if they hadn't fully proven themselves. This was always controversial, with some arguing it was necessary pragmatism and others insisting it compromised the Order's standards. The Clone Wars represented perhaps the most significant shift in how trials were administered. The galaxy-spanning conflict created unprecedented demand for Jedi Knights, while simultaneously providing countless opportunities for Padawans to prove themselves in real combat. The Council increasingly relied on field performance rather than formal trials, elevating Padawans based on their actions during the war. This was efficient and arguably more realistic than artificial tests, but it also meant that an entire generation of knights had been forged in war, with all the psychological and philosophical implications that carried. Different Jedi academies and temples throughout the galaxy sometimes developed their own variations on the trials. The Almus Academy, for instance, had its own approach to testing Padawans, tailored to the specific philosophy and circumstances of that institution. While the core principles remained the same, the specific tests might differ significantly from what a Padawan would face on Coruscant. This diversity was generally seen as healthy, allowing the Order to adapt to local conditions while maintaining overall standards. The trials also had to account for the incredible diversity of species within the Jedi Order. What constituted an appropriate test for a human Padawan might not work for a Wookiee, a Yoda's species member, or a Hutt. Physical challenges had to be calibrated to different species' capabilities. Tests that relied on verbal communication had to be adapted for species that didn't speak Basic. The Council worked to ensure that the trials were fair across this diversity, testing essential qualities rather than species-specific abilities. Technology played an increasing role in the trials over time. The trials chamber in the Jedi Temple incorporated sophisticated holographic projectors and environmental controls that could create incredibly
realistic scenarios. Padawans might face simulated enemies that looked, moved, and even felt real through force feedback. They might navigate environments that appeared to be distant planets or ancient ruins, all without leaving the temple. This technology made the trials safer and more controlled, though some argued it also made them less authentic than real-world challenges. There were also debates within the Order about whether the trials tested the right things. Some Jedi argued that the emphasis on combat skills in the Trial of Skill was misplaced, that the Order should focus more on diplomatic and scholarly abilities. Others felt that the Trial of the Flesh was unnecessarily brutal, that there were better ways to test resilience than subjecting Padawans to pain and loss. These debates never fully resolved, but they did lead to gradual evolution in how the trials were conceived and administered. The fall of the Jedi Order during the Clone Wars and the subsequent rise of the Galactic Empire effectively ended the traditional trial system. When Luke Skywalker began training a new generation of Jedi decades later, he had to reconstruct the trials based on incomplete information and his own understanding of what Jedi should be. His approach differed in significant ways from the old Order's methods, reflecting both the changed circumstances and his own philosophy. Whether his version of the trials was better or worse than what came before is a question that continues to be debated. Throughout all these changes and variations, certain core principles remained constant. The trials existed to ensure that Jedi Knights were prepared for their responsibilities. They tested not just skills, but character. They pushed Padawans to their limits to reveal what they were truly made of, and they served as a rite of passage, marking the transition from student to independent Jedi in a way that was meaningful and memorable. Let's examine some specific examples of Jedi who underwent the trials to see how these tests played out in practice and what they revealed about the individuals who faced them. Obi-Wan Kenobi's path to knighthood was dramatic and tragic. His master, Qui-Gon Jinn, was killed by Darth Maul during the Battle of Naboo. In the aftermath of that fight, as Qui-Gon lay dying, Obi-Wan made a promise to train Anakin Skywalker, the boy his master had believed was the chosen one. But Obi-Wan was still a Padawan himself. He hadn't yet passed his trials or been elevated to Knight. The Jedi Council recognized that Obi-Wan's battle with Darth Maul had effectively served as his trials. He had demonstrated exceptional skill in combat, holding his own against a Sith Lord. He had shown tremendous courage, continuing to fight even after watching his master fall. The loss of Qui-Gon served as his trial of the flesh, a devastating blow that he had to process and move beyond. His determination to honor Qui-Gon's final wish demonstrated his spirit and insight. Council elevated Obi-Wan to knighthood and, in an unusual move, granted him permission to take Anakin as his Padawan, despite his own youth and inexperience. This was controversial, with some council members, particularly Yoda, expressing doubts about whether Obi-Wan was ready for such a responsibility. But Obi-Wan had made a promise to his dying master, and the council ultimately chose to honor that promise, trusting that Obi-Wan would rise to the challenge. Anakin Skywalker's elevation to knighthood came during the Clone Wars, after years of service as Obi-Wan's Padawan. Anakin never underwent formal trials in the traditional sense. Instead, the Council determined that his actions during the war had proven him in all necessary areas. His combat prowess was legendary, his courage undeniable. The loss of his arm to Count Dooku served as his trial of the flesh. His resistance to Dooku's attempts to turn him demonstrated his spirit, at least at that time. However, Anakin's elevation was complicated by political factors. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine had been pushing for Anakin to be made a knight and later a master as part of his long-term plan to corrupt the young Jedi. The Council elevated Anakin to knighthood based on his genuine accomplishments, but they refused to grant him the rank of master when Palpatine appointed him to the Council as the Chancellor's representative. This decision, while justified by Anakin's relative youth and the unusual circumstances of his Council appointment, created resentment that Palpatine exploited. Anakin's story illustrates both the strengths and weaknesses of passing trials through field service. His combat abilities and courage were thoroughly proven by the war, but the trials might have revealed other issues, particularly his struggle with attachment and his vulnerability to manipulation that formal testing could have identified. Whether this would have changed his ultimate fate is unknowable, but it raises questions about whether the wartime approach to trials was as thorough as the traditional method. Ahsoka Tano's situation was unique and tragic. She was Anakin's Padawan during the Clone Wars, and her skills and character were evident to everyone who worked with her. She was approaching the point where she would have been ready for her trials, but before that could happen, she was framed for a terrorist attack on the Jedi Temple. The Council, believing the evidence against her, expelled her from the Order so she could be tried by the Republic's military courts. Ahsoka's efforts to prove her innocence, her investigation into who had actually committed the bombing, demonstrated exactly the kind of insight and determination that the trial of insight was meant to test.
When the truth was revealed and she was exonerated, the council offered to reinstate her and grant her knighthood, acknowledging that her ordeal had effectively served as her trials. But Ahsoka refused. The council's willingness to believe she was guilty, their failure to stand by her when she needed them most, had shattered her faith in the Order. She walked away, choosing to leave the Jedi rather than accept knighthood from an institution she no longer trusted. Her decision was a devastating indictment of the Order's failings, a reminder that passing the trials meant nothing if the Order itself had lost its way. Luke Skywalker's path to becoming a Jedi was entirely different from the traditional model, as he trained during a period when the old order had been destroyed and its methods largely lost. His training with Yoda on Dagobah was intense but abbreviated, cut short when Luke left to rescue his friends on Cloud City. During that rescue attempt, he faced Darth Vader and learned the devastating truth that Vader was his father. Luke's experience in the Darkside Cave on Dagobah served as a kind of trial of spirit, forcing him to confront his potential for darkness. His battle with Vader on Cloud City, where he lost his hand, functioned as his trial of the flesh. His decision to return to Dagobah and complete his training showed his commitment and insight. And his final confrontation with Vader and the Emperor, where he refused to kill his father and nearly died for that choice, demonstrated courage and spirit beyond what any formal trial could test. Yoda's final words to Luke, "No more training do you require. Already know you that which you need," served as Luke's elevation to knighthood, though without the formal ceremony or the presence of a council. Luke became a Jedi Knight through his choices and actions, proving himself in the most real and dangerous trials imaginable. His path showed that while the formal trials had value, what truly made someone a Jedi was their character and their choices, not their performance in controlled tests. These examples illustrate the diversity of paths to knighthood and the flexibility the Order maintained in recognizing when a Padawan had proven themselves. The trials were important, but they were ultimately a means to an end, a way of ensuring that knights were prepared for their responsibilities. When circumstances provided alternative ways to demonstrate that preparation, the Order was willing to adapt. The Jedi trials also had a significant psychological and emotional dimension that's worth exploring. For Padawans approaching this crucial test, the trials represented not just a practical challenge, but a profound source of stress and anxiety. Understanding this psychological aspect helps us appreciate the full impact of the trials on those who faced them. From early in their training, younglings knew about the trials. They heard stories from older students, listened to masters discuss past trials, and understood that this test awaited them in their future. This knowledge created a kind of background pressure that intensified as they grew older and approached the age when trials typically occurred. Some Padawans handled this pressure well, using it as motivation to train harder and prepare thoroughly. Others struggled with anxiety, worrying about whether they would be good enough, whether they would pass, whether they would disappoint their master and the Order. The relationship between master and Padawan became particularly complex as the trials approached. Masters had to balance their role as teacher and mentor
with their responsibility to honestly assess whether their apprentice was ready. Some masters were overly protective, hesitant to put their Padawan forward for trials because they feared failure or loss. Others pushed too hard, presenting their apprentice for trials before they were truly prepared because of their own ego or ambition. The best masters managed to be both supportive and realistic, helping their Padawan prepare while honestly evaluating their readiness. For Padawans, the trials represented a kind of identity crisis. Their entire life up to that point had been defined by their status as a learner, as someone in training. The trials marked the potential end of that identity and the beginning of something new. This transition, even when successful, involved loss. The close bond with their master would change. The structure and security of apprenticeship would be replaced by the independence and responsibility of knighthood. Even Padawans who desperately wanted to become knights often felt ambivalent about leaving behind the familiar role they'd inhabited for so long. The fear of failure was particularly intense because the stakes were so high. Failing the trials didn't just mean not becoming a knight. It meant potentially being assigned to the service corps, leaving the order, or having to face the shame and disappointment of not measuring up. For Padawans who had devoted their entire lives to becoming Jedi Knights, who had sacrificed normal childhoods and family relationships for this goal, failure was almost unthinkable. This pressure could be motivating, but it could also be crushing. Some Padawans developed unhealthy coping mechanisms for dealing with trial-related stress. They might become obsessive about training, pushing themselves to exhaustion in an attempt to be perfectly prepared. They might become withdrawn, isolating themselves from friends and fellow Padawans. They might develop anxiety disorders, experiencing panic attacks or intrusive thoughts about failure. Masters and temple healers had to watch for these signs and intervene when necessary, helping Padawans process their stress in healthier ways. The trials themselves were designed to be stressful, to push Padawans beyond their comfort zones and reveal how they handled pressure. But there was a fine line between productive stress that promoted growth and destructive stress that caused harm. The council had to calibrate the trials carefully, making them challenging enough to be meaningful, but not so overwhelming that they traumatized Padawans or pushed them toward the dark side. The emotional aftermath of the trials was significant regardless of the outcome. Padawans who passed experienced a complex mix of emotions: relief, pride, joy, but also sometimes guilt if friends had failed, or anxiety about the new responsibilities they were taking on. Those who failed faced disappointment, shame, and the difficult process of figuring out what came next. Masters had to be particularly attentive during this period, helping their Padawans process whatever emotions arose. There was also a social dimension to the trials that affected how Padawans experienced them. Within the temple, there was an informal hierarchy based on age and advancement. Younglings looked up to Padawans, and Padawans looked up to knights. Passing the trials meant moving up in this hierarchy, gaining respect and status. Failing meant remaining in a subordinate position, or worse, moving to the service corps where one's status was ambiguous.
This social pressure added another layer of stress to an already challenging situation. The trials also affected relationships between Padawans. Friends who trained together might face their trials at different times, with some passing while others failed. This could create distance and awkwardness in relationships that had previously been close. Padawans who passed might feel guilty about their success when friends struggled. Those who failed might feel resentful or envious of friends who succeeded. Navigating these complex emotions required maturity and emotional intelligence that not all Padawans possessed. For some Padawans, the trials became an obsession that distorted their entire approach to being a Jedi. Instead of focusing on serving others and growing in the Force, they became fixated on passing the tests, on achieving knighthood as an end in itself. This was exactly the opposite of what the trials were meant to promote. The tests existed to ensure that knights were prepared to serve, not to create a competitive environment where Padawans focused on personal achievement above all else. The Jedi Order tried to address these psychological challenges through various means. Masters were trained to recognize signs of unhealthy stress and to help their Padawans develop better coping strategies. Temple healers and counselors were available to Padawans who needed additional support. The Order emphasized that the trials were not the measure of a person's worth, that there were many ways to serve, and that failing to become a knight didn't make someone a failure as a person. But despite these efforts, the psychological pressure of the trials remained intense. This was, in some ways, intentional. The Order believed that Jedi Knights needed to be able to handle pressure, to function under stress, to make good decisions when the stakes were high. The trials tested this ability, and the stress leading up to them was part of that test. A Padawan who couldn't handle the pressure of the trials probably wasn't ready for the pressure of being a knight.
This raises an interesting philosophical question. Was the psychological stress of the trials a necessary part of preparing Jedi for their roles? Or was it an unnecessary burden that could have been reduced without compromising the test's effectiveness? The Order clearly believed the former, but there were always some who argued for the latter, who thought the trials could be reformed to be less psychologically demanding, while still testing the necessary qualities. The Jedi trials also had a significant impact on the broader culture and structure of the Jedi Order. They weren't just individual tests, but a crucial mechanism that shaped how the Order functioned and maintained its standards. Understanding this institutional dimension helps us see why the trials were so important to the Order's identity and operation. The trials served as a quality control mechanism, ensuring that everyone who bore the title of Jedi Knight had demonstrated a minimum level of competence and character. This was crucial for maintaining the Order's reputation and effectiveness. When a Jedi Knight arrived on a planet to mediate a dispute or investigate a crime, people needed to trust that this person was capable and trustworthy. The trials provided that assurance, signaling that this individual had been thoroughly tested and found worthy. This quality control function became even more important as the Order grew larger and more diverse. With thousands of Jedi spread across the galaxy, the Order needed standardized methods for evaluating readiness for knighthood. The trials provided this standardization, ensuring that a knight elevated on Coruscant met the same standards as one elevated at a remote temple on the Outer Rim. This consistency was essential for maintaining the Order's coherence as a galaxy-spanning institution. The trials also served an important socialization function.
They marked a clear transition point in a Jedi's life, a moment when their role and responsibilities fundamentally changed. This clarity helped both the individual and the Order adjust to the new relationship. After passing the trials, a Padawan knew they were now a knight, with all that entailed. Their former master knew the apprenticeship was over, and they needed to relate to their former student differently. The Order knew this person was now available for independent missions and could be trusted with greater responsibilities. The ceremony that accompanied successful completion of the trials reinforced this socialization function. The ritual of severing the Padawan braid, the formal words of elevation, the gathering of the Council and other Jedi. All of this created a memorable, meaningful moment that marked the transition. Rituals like this are important in any organization, but particularly in one like the Jedi Order, where identity and role were so central to how members understood themselves. The trials also functioned as a motivational tool, giving Padawans a clear goal to work toward. Human psychology responds well to concrete objectives, and the trials provided that. A Padawan could measure their progress by how close they were to being ready for the trials, could set specific goals related to developing the skills and qualities the trials would test. This helped structure their training and gave them a sense of purpose and direction. However, this motivational function had a potential downside. If Padawans became too focused on passing the trials as an end in itself, they might lose sight of the larger purpose of being a Jedi. The trials were meant to ensure readiness for service, but they could become an obstacle that Padawans fixated on rather than a stepping stone toward their real work. The Order had to constantly remind Padawans that knighthood was a beginning, not an ending, that passing the trials was important, but not the ultimate goal. The trials also played a role in the Order's internal politics and power dynamics. Council members who administered the trials had significant influence over who became knights and who didn't. This power could potentially be abused, with council members favoring Padawans who shared their philosophical views or came from certain lineages. The Order had safeguards against such abuse, including the requirement that the full council vote on elevations and the tradition of masters advocating for their Padawans. But the potential for politics to influence the trials was always present. Different philosophical factions within the Order sometimes disagreed about what the trials should test and how they should be administered. Some Jedi believed the trials should focus more on combat skills, preparing knights for the dangerous missions they would face. Others argued for greater emphasis on diplomatic and scholarly abilities, reflecting a vision of Jedi as peacekeepers and sages rather than warriors. These debates influenced how the trials evolved over time, with different eras emphasizing different aspects depending on which faction held more influence. The trials also affected how the Order allocated its resources. Preparing Padawans for the trials required significant investment of time and effort from masters, training facilities, and support staff. The trials themselves, particularly when conducted in the formal trials chamber, required resources to set up and administer. The Order had to balance this investment against other demands on its resources, deciding how much to spend on trial preparation versus other priorities. There was also a demographic dimension to the trials.
The rate at which Padawans passed and became knights affected the order's size and composition. If the trials were too difficult, fewer Padawans would pass and the order would shrink, or at least not grow as quickly. If the trials were too easy, the order might grow rapidly but with lower average quality among its knights. The council had to calibrate the trials to maintain an appropriate balance, ensuring high standards while also allowing the order to maintain sufficient numbers to fulfill its responsibilities. The trials also interacted with the order's relationship to the broader galaxy. When Jedi Knights succeeded in their missions, when they resolved conflicts and brought peace, it reflected well on the Order and justified the Republic's support. But when Knights failed, when they made mistakes or fell to the dark side, it damaged the Order's reputation. The trials were meant to minimize these failures by ensuring that only truly prepared individuals became knights. But no test is perfect, and some who passed the trial still failed in the field, raising questions about whether the trials were adequate or needed reform. During the Clone Wars, the trials' role in the Order's functioning changed significantly. The war created urgent demand for more knights, while simultaneously providing real-world testing opportunities that made formal trials seem less necessary. This shift was pragmatic and probably inevitable given the circumstances, but it also represented a fundamental change in how the Order operated. The long-term consequences of this change were never fully realized, as the Order fell before the war ended. But it raises interesting questions about how the trials might have evolved if the Order had survived. The trials also had a symbolic importance that went beyond their practical function. They represented the Order's commitment to excellence, its refusal to compromise on standards, even when doing so might be convenient. They embodied the principle that being a Jedi Knight meant something, that the title carried weight and responsibility. In a galaxy where many organizations and institutions were corrupt or had lowered their standards, the Jedi Order's maintenance of rigorous trials was a statement about who they were and what they valued. This symbolic function meant that debates about the trials were never just about practical questions of how to best evaluate Padawans. They were also about the Order's identity and values. Proposals to make the trials easier or to eliminate them entirely were often resisted not because they were necessarily bad ideas practically, but because they seemed to threaten something fundamental about what it meant to be a Jedi. The trials were woven into the Order's sense of itself, and changing them meant changing the Order in ways that went beyond the immediate practical effects. As we near the end of our exploration of the Jedi trials, it's worth reflecting on what these tests tell us about the Jedi Order and its philosophy. The trials weren't just practical evaluations. They were expressions of the Order's deepest values and beliefs about what made someone worthy of being called a Jedi Knight. The 5 trials, skill, courage, flesh, spirit, and insight, represented the Order's understanding of what qualities a Jedi needed to succeed. Technical competence was important, hence the trial of skill, but it wasn't enough. A Jedi also needed courage to face danger, resilience to endure suffering, spiritual strength to resist the dark side, and wisdom to make sound judgments. The comprehensiveness of the trials reflected the Order's belief that being a Jedi required excellence across multiple dimensions, that weakness in any area could be fatal. The trials also reflected the Order's emphasis on individual growth and self-mastery. Each trial required the Padawan to overcome something within themselves, whether it was fear, attachment, ignorance, or weakness. The tests weren't about defeating external enemies, though that might be part of them. They were about mastering oneself, about becoming the kind of person who could be trusted with the power and responsibility of a Jedi Knight. This focus on internal development was central to the Jedi philosophy. The flexibility the Order maintained in administering the trials showed a pragmatic streak that sometimes gets overlooked in discussions of Jedi philosophy. The Order had high standards, but they weren't rigid or dogmatic about how those standards were met. They recognized that real-world experiences could be more meaningful than artificial tests, that circumstances might require adaptation, that different individuals might need different approaches. This flexibility helped the Order remain relevant and effective across thousands of years and countless different situations. At the same time, the trials revealed some of the Order's limitations and blind spots. The emphasis on detachment and non-attachment, tested particularly in the trial of the flesh and the trial of spirit, reflected a philosophy that sometimes seemed to deny the importance of relationships and emotions. The Order's insistence that Jedi avoid attachment, that they be willing to let go of everything and everyone, created psychological and emotional challenges that not all Jedi handled well. Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side was, in many ways, a failure of this aspect of Jedi philosophy. The trials also reflected the Order's somewhat militaristic culture, particularly in later eras. The trial of skill's emphasis on combat, the trial of courage's focus on facing danger. These suggested an Order that saw itself primarily as warriors, despite its stated commitment to peace. This tension between the Jedi's role as peacekeepers and their function as the Republic's military force was never fully resolved, and it contributed to the Order's eventual downfall. The trial's existence also raised questions about the nature of wisdom and readiness. Can you really test whether someone is ready to be a Jedi Knight? Can a series of challenges, no matter how well designed, truly reveal someone's character and predict how they'll perform in the field? The Order believed the answer was yes, or at least that the trials were the best method available. But the fact that some who passed the trials later failed, while some who never underwent formal trials became great Jedi, suggests that the relationship between trial performance and actual readiness was more complex than the Order sometimes acknowledged. The trials also embodied a certain elitism that was both a strength and a weakness of the Jedi Order.
By maintaining high standards and refusing to compromise, the Order ensured that its knights were genuinely capable. But this also meant that many who might have served well in some capacity were excluded, either failing the trials or never getting the chance to attempt them. The Order's commitment to excellence sometimes came at the cost of inclusivity, and this created tensions that were never fully resolved. Looking at the trials from a modern perspective, we might question some of their assumptions and methods. The trial of the flesh's emphasis on enduring pain and loss seems almost cruel, potentially traumatizing Padawans in ways that might not be necessary or helpful. The trial of spirits' focus on confronting one's potential for darkness could be seen as a form of psychological manipulation. The overall stress and pressure of the trials might be viewed as excessive, creating unnecessary suffering in the name of testing readiness. But we should also recognize that the Jedi Order existed in a very different context than our world. They were preparing people for genuinely dangerous work, for situations where failure could mean death for themselves and others. The galaxy they served was often violent and chaotic, filled with threats that required Jedi to be exceptionally capable and resilient. In that context, rigorous trials that pushed Padawans to their limits made sense. The Order couldn't afford to elevate knights who weren't truly ready, because the consequences of that failure were too severe. The trials also represented a kind of wisdom about human nature and development. The Order understood that people grow through challenge, that facing and overcoming difficulties builds character in ways that easy success never can. The trials were difficult because difficulty was part of their purpose. They weren't meant to be comfortable or easy. They were meant to transform Padawans, to push them to become more than they had been, to reveal capabilities they might not have known they possessed. In the end, the Jedi trials were a reflection of the Order itself, with all its strengths and weaknesses, its wisdom and its blind spots. They were an attempt to systematize something that might be inherently unsystematizable, to create a reliable method for evaluating readiness for a role that was complex and multifaceted. They succeeded more often than they failed, producing generations of capable knights who served the galaxy well. But they were never perfect, and the Order's eventual fall suggests that perhaps the trials, like the Order itself, needed evolution that never came. As we conclude this exploration of the Jedi trials, we're left with a deeper appreciation for these ancient tests and what they represented. They were more than just examinations. They were rites of passage, transformative experiences that marked the transition from student to independent Jedi. They were quality control mechanisms that maintained the Order's standards across millennia. They were expressions of the Order's deepest values and beliefs about what made someone worthy of being called a Jedi Knight. For the Padawans who faced them, the trials were among the most significant experiences of their lives. They were challenges that tested everything they had learned, everything they had become during their years of training. They were opportunities to prove themselves, to demonstrate that they were ready for the responsibilities of knighthood. And they were transformative experiences that changed how they saw themselves and their place in the Order. The trials remind us that growth often comes through challenge, that we discover our true capabilities
when we're pushed beyond our comfort zones. They remind us that standards matter, that maintaining excellence requires refusing to compromise, even when it would be easier to do so. And they remind us that transitions, those moments when we move from one phase of life to another, benefit from ritual and ceremony that mark their significance. The Jedi Order is gone now, destroyed by the very darkness it sought to oppose. The trials, along with so much else of Jedi tradition, were lost when the temple fell and the Order was purged. But the principles they embodied, the values they tested, these remain relevant. The idea that those who would lead or protect should be thoroughly tested, that they should demonstrate not just skill but character, that they should prove themselves worthy of the trust placed in them. This is as important now as it was in the days of the Old Republic. When Luke Skywalker began training a new generation of Jedi, he had to reconstruct the trials based on incomplete information and his own understanding. His version differed from what came before, adapted to new circumstances and informed by his own experiences. This evolution was appropriate. The trials were never meant to be static, unchanging traditions. They were meant to serve a purpose, to ensure that Jedi Knights were prepared for their responsibilities. How that purpose was best served could and should change as circumstances changed. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Jedi trials is that readiness for responsibility must be earned, not assumed. The trials existed because the Order understood that wanting to be a knight wasn't enough, that good intentions weren't sufficient, that even years of training didn't automatically mean someone was ready. They had to prove it, had to demonstrate, through their actions and choices, that they possessed what was necessary. This principle applies far beyond the Jedi Order, to any situation where people are given power or responsibility over others. The trials also remind us that testing and evaluation, while necessary, are imperfect. Some who passed the trials later failed. Some who never underwent formal trials became great Jedi. The tests were tools, useful but not infallible. They helped the Order make better decisions about who to elevate to knighthood, but they didn't eliminate all uncertainty or guarantee success. This is a valuable reminder in our own world, where we often place too much faith in tests and evaluations, forgetting that they're approximations of qualities that are ultimately too complex to fully capture in any examination. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the Jedi trials. These ancient tests shaped the destiny of the Jedi Order and the countless individuals who underwent them. They represented the Order's commitment to excellence, its understanding of what made someone worthy of being called a Jedi Knight. And they remind us that growth comes through challenge, that standards matter, and that those who would bear great responsibility must prove themselves worthy of that trust. If you enjoyed this exploration of Star Wars lore, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. It really helps us continue creating this content. Until next time, may the Force be with you, and may you face your own trials with the courage and wisdom of a Jedi Knight. Good night, and sleep well.